And welcome back to Twisted Remedies podcast. My guest today is Dr. Nicole Sawyer, who is a licensed clinical psychologist since 2007. She's a contract instructor for NAMI, which is National Alliance on Mental Illness. Many years of supporting first responder agencies with crisis intervention, peer support. Also, contract examiner for Department of Defense. A lead trainer military culture initiative for Dare Mighty Things, and a former VA psychologist. It's a whole lot of stuff. I think all of that should explain why Dr. Sawyer is on the show. This is, I was just saying before I hit the button, this is my first PhD on the show, so I feel like we're reaching different levels. So I'm excited. Dr. Sawyer, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. I was really flattered to even be considered as a guest on your show. And some of those things you're listing off those are stretching way back for me for sort of the context of where I'm coming from with this work. VA, that was back in 2012 was when I left the VA, so that we're talking, over 10 years ago now. But that really was part of the sort of kicking off point trajectory of where we're at now, working with public safety and police, fire, corrections, dispatchers, and of course in that mix includes many folks who have served in the military. So it all sort of blended together and crossed over really easily.
Yeah, well, and I think the fact that it goes back that far, I think gives you a lot of depth on the topics. So that's and part of, so for people who have been listening for a while, Mike Cancellieri from Frontline Foundations came on, and the way this connection was made is Mike said something to the effect of, there are 3 psychologists I trust, or something like that, and you were on that list. And I take what Mike says pretty seriously, because he's I think when he speaks, it's very thoughtful. So that goes a long way with me, and I think that's an endorsement that rings true. And again, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, I appreciate that. No, Mike was at I believe he was at a conference in Vermont that I was a keynote speaker for, and I remember he walked up to me afterwards and said something to the effect of, I've never heard a doctor talk like that before. I said, well, awesome. Well, I'm glad to introduce you. There's more of us out there, I swear.
That's great. So going back to your kind of your early days in the field, you started as a staff psychologist for a practice, from what I have seen. And at some point, you shifted sort of to the veteran first responder groups. What led to that? It seemed like a distinctive shift. What led to that shift?
Yeah. So I think, when you're getting an education in graduate school, ideally, and this is, ideally you're getting a really generalist education. You're learning a wide breadth of psychology. And then you go out and you try to find your internships and your postdoctoral education so that you can get your license, right? And so for me, I landed in community mental health, which couldn't have been a better place to land. And I recommend it to anybody pursuing this line of work to start in community mental health, because you're encountering everyone and everything every single day. But my real focus was trauma. I really enjoyed working with people who were actively trying to recover from trauma. And so in the community mental health world, those folks ended up getting funneled into my office, and I'm a 22-year-old know-nothing, who is fresh out of graduate school, and I'm sitting across from folks who have been struggling and suffering with trauma from their, whether it be their law enforcement career, whether it be, Vietnam. I mean, even at that time, I was still seeing folks from the Vietnam era coming in for the first time to get some sort of, help. And I found that I really connected with that population. It really spoke to me. On reflection, it makes a lot of sense. I grew up in a working class family where people serving, whether it be serving the military or serving their communities, was just sort of par for the course. And had never really occurred to me how valuable that was until I was sitting across from folks saying, hey, I get this. And so from there, it just evolved. And eventually, you move your way out of community mental health because you actually want to make an income that you can pay rent with. And so then and I ended up a part-time gig at the VA, and I learned a lot there about the system. Not the best education and not the best system, but by learning so much, I was able to sort of take that with me and help other folks. And that, once you get into the veteran world, there's no way that you can avoid getting into the public safety world. It just goes hand in hand. So here we are, 12 or so years later. And it's all I do every day is talk with folks about, surviving their career in public safety, dealing with critical incident trauma, sometimes dealing with trauma that they experienced before they even came into a law enforcement or a fire service profession. And how do we make sure that those two things stay separate so that they can be successful in their careers, which, 99.9% of them will. But they may need a little extra help. And so that's what we do now. I was in preparation for this. Last week, I was actually in front of a bunch of firefighters. We were talking about career survival, and a veteran in the group, he spoke up and he said, we were talking about feelings, right? And he spoke up and he said, yeah, I don't have feelings. Like that doesn't work for me, right? Like I chop wood, I work out, I dig ditches, I will, give you a handshake and a bro hug if you need it, but like, I don't do feelings. And, really, he was one of the most beloved people in the room. When I look at him and I heard him speaking, he was the warmest, most genuine person in the room. And you could tell that people appreciated and trusted him. But he didn't recognize that the way he presents actually invokes feelings in everyone else. Really right. Positive, encouraging, and supportive feelings. But it was one of those great moments. And I immediately thought of this podcast coming up because what he was identifying was that, he'd been through many deployments, many really, really strenuous deployments. And he's like, feelings don't have any place for me. If I had too many feelings, I'm not going to survive. Instead, I'm in a survival mode, and I do what it takes to get by every day. And I feel connected to people, and I enjoy my life, but I don't get too deep into the weeds. That's a scary place. And I just immediately thought, this is this guy gets it, right? And he's talking to the right people. And I don't think he'd ever had anybody say to him, like, that makes 100% sense. Like, you're right. I mean, that, like reinforcing that, that's real. Trying to deny that, or saying, no, we need to get you into your feelings more. That's not fair, because this person is thriving, in a way that works for them.
Yeah. I think what you're describing to me sounds like meeting people where they are, and a lot of, like critical incident stuff and just in law enforcement, especially for, it's where my background is. A lot of the early days, first of all, there was nothing for years. And then we started doing that kind of thing, but it typically started with, let's sit in a circle and talk about our feelings. And the fastest way to lose a room full of cops and firefighters is to open with that, and then force people to. I remember we were debriefing like a pretty heinous homicide that we had. We had all the investigators in there, and one of a good friend of mine, as the debrief is going on, he's like, this is going to make things worse for me. I'm going to go. You guys enjoy this. This is not for me. And the look of shock on the person's face who was running it was pretty telling. But like everybody, I think this illustrates that everybody has to find their own way to recovery, whatever that 100%. Looks like.
Yeah. And I think what this individual too was really highlighting is that he, much like a lot of the folks in the room, but for different reasons, at this point in their careers, your body moves into like a survival state, right? When you are encountering trauma after trauma, when you're saturated in trauma, and that's really the nature of your job, physiologically, your body starts making changes to keep you alive. One of the things that is really important for people to recognize is that our brains are not, the evolution in our brains has been minimal. Our brains, especially deep down, right? And we talk about that reptilian part of the brain where the amygdala lives and the hippocampus and hypothalamus and all that stuff is the same today, right now, as it was millennia and millennia ago when we were just getting up on 2 feet. And it's the same as the squirrel that, skitters across the road in front of your car. And it's the same as your dog, right? It's all the same. It's survival based. And when you're experiencing repeated trauma, your brain starts to sort of hunker down in that space, because that space is what keeps us alive. And feelings is sort of a luxury of a person where survival is guaranteed. We didn't survive this long as a species because we were, capable of walking outside of our cave and appreciating the beauty of the sunrise, and that somehow fulfilled us, right? No, we walked out of our cave, looked both ways, said, great, there's no saber-toothed tiger today. Awesome. We might be able to go get fresh water, right? Like that, right. And our brain doesn't know that every time we respond to a trauma out in the community, that isn't our trauma. Or our frontal lobe tells us, hey, stay in your lane, like not your emergency. Our frontal lobe can tell us that, but that little amygdala is being lit off for every single trauma we're encountering as if it's ours. And so that physiological response, we can't do anything about. We have a lot of really great human resources that help us, determine whether or not it's something we need to apply ourselves to in a survival state. But that happens second. First, we have that amygdala response. And so this individual, I feel like, was kind of identifying, like, listen, I've been in a survival state for like 30 years now. This is how it works for me. And for folks who are, enduring really rigorous long-term public safety careers, they too can end up in that survival state. And we have all kinds of symptoms that sort of evolve, right? The high blood pressure and the metabolism issues that we have and the sleep disorders and all the things. I mean, we can just go tick down the list of things that, folks after a 30-year career are experiencing. And so much of that is rooted in that deep sort of primitive part of our brain. We have to be willing to acknowledge that. We have to be willing to meet people in that survival state before we start talking about effectively managing and experiencing our emotions. We can get there, but we have to meet people first in that physiological state of survival that we're finding so many folks when they're ending up in clinicians' offices or in debriefing rooms.
Yeah, well, I love how you described that, because I remember once I finally decided to start doing the work and get the cobwebs cleared, I was in for an EMDR session, and stuff that I had gone to years prior that wasn't the last trauma that went into the bucket. It was like other stuff that I didn't really chalk up as trauma, but it was just all these things kept coming out, and I'm like, wow, why am I thinking about that? And that's the wonder of EMDR. It's just like let your brain do the work. But I remember sitting there after going, wow, there was a lot of stuff that I really just kind of moved, like go to this one, go to the next one, go to the next one. And there was no time to, let's sit and process this at the, when it's done. And there I was, all of that was just coming up. And I found that really, like, it was kind of mind blowing to just like all these things I hadn't thought of in years that were just unprocessed trauma floating around in there somewhere. It was really amazing I'm glad it happened because it helped me get where I am now. But I was just sitting there like, why is this stuff coming up? And fortunately, my therapist was very skilled and was like, no, just let it, see where you go, and let's do the next. She waved her fingers at me, and the voodoo magic happens.
Right, the voodoo, right. Well, and that unlocking is so important, because you're absolutely right. When you're just chasing, event after event, trauma after trauma, your brain just sort of, in an effort to be efficient, right? Our brains really, really want to be efficient. And efficient doesn't always mean good for us or healthy. And so in an effort to be efficient, it just, instead of taking the time to actually allow your brain to absorb the information, it's just, locking it down and locking it down and locking it down in that survival center of your brain, saying, well, we got through that. Let's move on to the next. And then we got through that. And you're absolutely right. Treatments like EMDR really do wonders to help unlock that part, that trunk that's full of all of these experiences that you didn't even realize were having a physiological impact on you, let alone an emotional impact. And those emotions are often locked down with the experience because they go hand in hand. But we also can't just lock down some emotions, right? And that's where we start to experience that numbness and that detachment, right? Once our brain starts sort of, in an effort to be efficient, start locking down our emotional experiences of things, we lose access to lots of the entire continuum of emotion. One of the things that I talk about with folks is that when you try to suppress your anger, or you try to suppress your frustration, because, everybody, am I allowed to swear on here?
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody calls you an asshole every time you sort of, pipe up about something and you start trying to suppress those emotions. Well, everything else comes with it. So joy and pleasure and connection with people gets suppressed as well. And so you end up feeling numb and detached. And we decide that, we're no longer connected to people anymore. Forget it. I'm just an asshole now. I can't even be, out in the community. I can't communicate. I can't be in a relationship. And really that all goes back to that effort of our brain to try to be efficient in managing all of the feelings and all of the experiences that are locked down. And physically, right? Physically, we is a place that we can start to release these things. We have to understand that the population that we're talking about are not people, for the most part, who were raised in environments where, crying it out was an option. Right? And it still is, as much as we've sort of, come a long way in terms of how we raise boys in particular and acknowledge, emotions, and that has evolved. But it's still a rare situation where somebody's, cheering on their 6-year-old and, come on, Johnny, give a good cry and you'll feel better, right? That's not, it's still a rare situation. And that, not learning that skill at a really young age, and it is a skill, and it's a skill that has to be honed, because if you don't learn how to have sadness, and so you don't learn to trust your sadness and know that it will come, it will run its course, and it will end. If we don't learn that, well, when those feelings pop up, the easiest thing to do is to just turn it into irritability and anger, because that's familiar. And then we stuff that down, right? Because that makes us an asshole. And so very quickly, numbness and detachment and stoicism, which here in New England is celebrated, right, as a as a way of being, right? And that just becomes the MO. And then you put a person with that sort of mindset in a situation that is going to expect you to survive horrendous things over and over again for 30 years. Yeah, we're going to be pretty locked up by the end.
Well, and I think aside from all the stuff that this group we're talking about brings to the table before they even get there, the culture of law enforcement, veteran, military, firefighter, all these cultures are not really set up for, let's be vulnerable. Like, so it's
we're certainly not. Right?
It's even if you come to it with those skills, they're not. I mean, that's hard to navigate and apply. Operate the way you need to operate while. There's a lot to all of this. I wish that's part of the reason that I think this conversation is important. All of this stuff that you have said so far, I wish when I got out of or in the police academy, somebody had really been like, this is what you can expect. This is how to make it 24 years without, all this other stuff kind of becoming an issue. And it's that I love kind of how you've set all that up so far.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, again, going back to, just recently having conversations with folks, and I spend a lot of time presenting to groups, whether they be firefighters or police officers or corrections officers or sometimes administrators, right? So sometimes there are chief officers in the room and, one of the things that comes up frequently is, to your point, this concept of, some of the people coming into the job now have a little bit more access to those feelings, but then what? The conversation is like, yeah, but where's the line? Now, we need people who are capable of absorbing a lot of shit and getting back out there and still doing the job. We have to have people who are capable of that. That's just the nature of the biz. But we also recognize that if we don't provide sort of emotional outlets, build in expectations for surviving this career mentally and physically, then, we're doing everyone a disservice, and we're all going to end up like the sergeant that we all tried not to end up like. And, so where's the line with, how emotive, how touchy-feely, how warm and fuzzy do we need to be? And how careful do we have to be about not crossing that line into legitimately having people in this line of work that shouldn't be here?
Right.
Because that is right. I mean, it is a fact. Not everyone can do this job. And that's a true statement. And I think, we don't know what that line is yet. I mean, what does that look like? I don't know. I don't have the answer.
I think it's a sliding scale too. I think that line is different for, like, some people are more geared toward working with kids. Some people are more geared toward, working other aspects of the job, at least. And again, I'm speaking from a law enforcement because that's what I know. But there's a gap where everybody fits into this gap, and one person may be over here more, one person may be over here more, but they're still within that window, and figuring out what that window looks like is the hard part.
It is. It's tough. And I think it's particularly challenging right now. We're in a huge transition phase. A lot of the folks who are leading organizations right now came up still underneath the suck it up buttercup concept, right? But they've watched change occur over the course of their career. And now they're leading organizations and trying to figure out, how do I lead an organization in a way that wasn't modeled for me? And now eventually the folks coming in, who are coming in today, like at this moment where, critical incident stress debriefings are the norm, mental health and wellness checks per year, and consultations with mental health professionals are free and supported by the department, and, all kinds of things that are just available now. Those folks will be leaders in the next 20 years. And then what, right? Then I think maybe we'll have a better picture. But right now we're still in that transition period of culture versus incoming employees versus outgoing administrators, and just trying to find that balance is particularly challenging.
Yeah. So I think this segues nicely into you testified in front of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2012 about. I read the whole transcript, by the way.
I was going to say, you dug that up, right?
It was fascinating. But you talk about in there, and I think you were talking about veterans because it was all related to VA. But I think it translates into first responders as well. You talked about there's a couple of things I want to unpack from that. One, you talked about the fear that comes from trying to get somebody to discuss these things and go to treatment because they're admitting some failure. And on top of that, I think there's a trust piece that is huge. One of my previous guests was a former New York firefighter, and he talked about he would go in to talk to the person provided, and he would meet with them, and it would take some time to build trust. And they were on a rotating thing, so by the time he built up trust, that person transfers out.
Yep.
And I think the VA probably operates somewhat similarly. And that person would leave, and then he had to start over with somebody else, which, they have a file in front of them, but he's now talking to a stranger and has to rebuild that trust with a new person. And I think I think I'm curious if you could just talk about how all of that, how you see a way through that.
A way through that. That's $1 million question.
What's the magic? What's the magic answer?
Ta-da! What you just described is the experience of many, many folks who have sought mental health care through the VA. It's also, though, the experience of folks who are seeking mental health care in a community mental health center as well. These are revolving doors of clinicians, and also a training ground for clinicians. So what ends up happening is, because they are huge conglomerate organizations, they have the resources to fill spots with clinicians who are in training who desperately need that kind of background to be successful in their careers. But they also end up being sometimes retirement gigs for clinicians on their way out of the career. And then, of course, we cannot neglect that there are absolutely super dedicated, really valuable and excellent clinicians that are doing their damnedest to provide the best services available. But the system itself is a slog. And it's a slog for the veterans trying to get in and get the services that they need, but it is absolutely a slog for the clinicians who know by the nature of the system that they are not able to provide the kinds of treatment at the quality that they know that the veteran deserves, because the demand is so high and the availability is so low. And it's just so that contributes as well to the turnover, right? Because clinicians get in there, they get a ton of experience, and they say, "Hey, this is really hard work, and I love it, but I'm burned out," and so they move on to other organizations. And so, building trust is, I can feel for that, for the veteran and for the veterans that I hear talk about how difficult that is. And I don't think that there's a solution in terms of making sure that you have a clinician that you can stick with. There's no guarantees in these kinds of systems. But what I would encourage people to do is that if you build consistency in your efforts, right? So if you're committed to a particular effort, and you are being forced to have to turn over, that if you yourself have established your own habits, if you have established your own commitment to your well-being, if you've brought in your team, right? So if you have a spouse who's supportive, if you have a brother that's supportive, if you have a peer that you know is your cheerleader, standing behind you every day, then make sure that those folks are aware of this transition that you are going to be going through when you're losing a clinician and picking up a new one, and making sure that those folks are able to support you in the good habits and the coping skills and whatever strategies you've been working on with that previous clinician. How do we keep moving forward with those and not feeling like we're starting over again? Because if you present yourself to a new clinician and say, "Hey, this is what I'm working on. Here's what was working for me. Here's what wasn't. I want to hit the ground running." Most of the time, those clinicians are going to say, "Awesome, let's go."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening instead is that there's lots of feelings of disconnect and distrust. And I don't know if I trust you to tell my story, and I don't want to have to tell my story all over again. So I'm going to just brush through it. And because I brushed through it, this new clinician doesn't really have the full picture. And so I can't trust her or him. And right. It's a vicious cycle. So it's building that network around you. That clinician is just one tool that should be in your toolbox of recovery. And that one clinician, right, if that has to turn over and change, yeah, that sucks. But if we maintain a toolbox with multiple angles of support, we're much more capable of recovering and moving forward from that transition. So I can't emphasize enough building that community around yourself and getting involved in other avenues of support, like things like jujitsu, right?
Yes. I agree 100%. Any other, I don't know. I'm still figuring out who listens to this thing. I know a bunch of people, in the fields we're talking about listen. I don't know if there's other therapists that listen, or, I'm hoping there's eventually a wide variety, but are there any, I hate to say tricks of the trade because that sounds incredibly cliche and minimizing, but are there any things that you have found, especially working with veterans and first responders, that help kind of get over that trust hurdle and that stigma hurdle, and just can really get things moving in the right direction, like faster than, all of the tell me about your feeling, like all of those kind of things.
Right. Well, so I can tell you what I say, because I do a lot of work helping to train clinicians as well to be sort of better attuned to the population. And I think one of the things that I focus on the most is showing up. This is a population that you can't just hang a shingle outside of your door and say, hey, I work with cops and firefighters and military veterans, come see me. You have to show up. You have to get involved in organizations. You have to show up at meetings. You have to attend trainings. You have to be where they are. And FaceTime makes a huge difference. And so, there are lots of organizations out there that run, charity events, and lots of organizations that have, whether it's a 5K run or you're attending a training and just sitting in the audience, but you're introducing yourself to other audience members, right? Those are the moments. Because when you show up, it shows a level of investment in the population. One of the things, and I know that the veteran community can certainly relate to this, when you're the hot topic in the media, or when your needs are the hot topic, everybody and their brother wants to jump on the money gravy train and come up with some app or some website or something that you sign up for, and it's going to solve all your problems, right?
Yep.
And and that whipped through the veteran community in the last decade or so, and it's really creeping into the first responder community now too. And I'm not to say this, there isn't value in some of these, things that have popped up. I don't, I certainly can't pass judgment on those. But what I do know is that it makes people very suspicious, right? So when a person does say, hey, I do that kind of work, the initial, reaction is, oh, really? Why? Now, first of all, I just want to clarify that this is not a particularly lucrative job doing this work, but it is lucrative in purpose and meaning and passion. But what happens though is that people start to wonder, like, are you doing this because this is the hot topic right now and like it's the cool thing to do, or are you
phoning
actually
it in?
Yeah, and that's a very reasonable suspicion. And so that's why I say to clinicians is that you have to show up, you have to be present, you have to take time out of your day that is not money making time. And you have to attend these events. You have to connect with other people. You've got to join the listservs, and you have to, because when you do that, then people's suspicions of you go way down, and they start to actually open their ears up and are willing to listen to what you have to say. But it takes step one first to get past that suspicion. And the thing that I would say to veterans and first responders when it comes to this stuff is that, giving, it's said frequently, and it's a frustrating thing to say, and I know there's truth to it, but it's frustrating nonetheless. People say you get one chance with a veteran or a first responder. If you send them to a clinician that sucks, that's it. They're never going to get help, right? And you've let them down. Well, unpopular opinion is that we too have to hold ourselves accountable and say, if I truly need help, and if I am really invested in doing the work, then I have to be willing to accept that not everyone is going to be a good fit for me. And not everybody is going to be the person that's going to help me on this journey. But there's only one way to find that out, and it's to show up.
Yep.
Right. And
it's
just like
a two-way
with the
street
clinicians,
for sure.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
You have to put yourself in the position. And yes, you might walk into that clinician's office and it might smell like patchouli, and there might be, pink heart pillows on the couch. And you might say, you know what? this is the lemon situation. I'm calling it quits. I'm turning around and heading out the door. You could do that. And then you move on to the next, because that's what we all have to do, right? So this is a really difficult decision to embark on mental health treatment. I'm not minimizing that at all. But once you've decided to do it, we have to commit. These are folks who can commit to so many other things. They can invest themselves in tremendous, very difficult things and persevere. This piece, this self-care piece, this part about saving their own lives sometimes is the hardest thing for them to be willing to invest in. And so we have to show up. The clinicians have to show up and make themselves worthy of your time and energy, but you have to show up as well and make decisions for your own needs, for your own mental health that says, this is a fit, this is not a good fit. I know that if I keep trying, I will find something that's going to work for me. So, it's a two-way street, to your point. It has to be a two-way street. Trust goes both ways.
Yeah, I've said numerous times on here that it's, finding an outlet, like for me, it's jujitsu, but finding the right therapist, not just finding a therapist, because, and like my path was, I was seeing a clinician and worked through some stuff, but it just wasn't, at some point it just became not the right fit. Like maybe I needed something different. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a good fit anymore. And that's on me to go. And I did. It took, there's a little lapse in there for me to figure this out. But
Sure.
Ultimately I was like, okay, I need to find somebody else to fill that void and keep this moving forward. And I think for me, the harder part was starting treatment in the first place. I didn't feel like it was as hard to switch and go, okay, this isn't a good fit. I need to make an adjustment. I think getting in the door, starting the process was definitely more daunting than, switching midway.
Absolutely. Right. But, and that's the piece, right, about investment and commitment. When that decision has been made, I need help. You have to be willing to go to whatever length necessary to get the help you need, right? If your buddy says, I need help, you're going to go to whatever length necessary to help him or her get what they need. We have got to be willing to flip that table around and say, if I can do it for them, I have to do it for me. And that's where this being successful in mental health treatment comes in. Because even when you find the right clinician, you're still the one having to do the work. You still have to show up every session. You still have to invest yourself in that work. They're really doing very little, but guiding you on a path that you already know how to walk, right? This is your story. But we have to, if you're going to invest, if you know you need to invest, then we've got to see it through.
You talked about the kind of the physical tolls that trauma and all of this stuff can take. I'm curious, is there a pattern? Is there something like that presents that you've seen with first responders, veterans, that whole group? Is there I guess a trend of how that physical manifestation of trauma affects that group, or is it just vary by person?
Well, I mean, it certainly varies widely by person, but there are certainly markers that are fairly common. For example, and again, a lot of this goes back to that survival mode, right, that our bodies go into. We'll see folks starting to have, headaches, sleep difficulties, and the sleep difficulties sort of evolve. It gets to a point where they are having trouble falling asleep because their brains are racing, right? We've all had those times before where we have just can't shut it down. Or that they're waking up frequently throughout the night and they're just not getting good quality sleep, right? Or even getting to the point where they just cannot fall asleep at all. So that starts to creep in. And then, for a lot of folks, we start to have that irritability, that edginess, right? That starts to, and one of the things I like to point out about irritability and edginess, it is almost universal, right? I mean, I have not met a first responder yet, or a military veteran, particularly with combat experience yet, who does not say, yeah, I could be a little grumpy, right? And whose spouse says a little, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And really what that is survival. If you think about primitive humans, right? Our primitive ancestors, didn't, again, going back to feelings, did not survive, because they appreciated, the beauty of the fur on the saber-toothed tiger that was chasing them, right? There's importance in being able to generate rage. Rage is a survival emotion. Anger is a survival emotion. The military knows this very well, right? I mean, this is, they sharpen and hone that tool of anger and rage from minute one at basic training, right? And what they're working to do is help you get very quick access to that feeling of rage so that you are willing to do difficult things, right? They're not bolstering your self-esteem and making you feel good about yourself, right?
Right.
They're basically helping you transition from fear to rage so that you will survive difficult circumstances. Well, when we have a brain that is traumatized repeatedly and stressed repeatedly, and then let's add in some sleeplessness, maybe not eating good healthy foods because we're just so busy, we're not consuming good food and on a regular basis, and so our brain starts getting into that survival mode. Well, that irritability, our brain thinks that we have to be prepared to survive at any given moment, and so irritability starts to hover just under the surface so that we can access it when that tiger leaps at us. And so that irritability is made available. And so just the slightest scratch causes us to be grumpy, to snap, to get upset about things that, prior to that survival mode would have maybe rolled right off our backs. And that's one of the first things our families start to notice, right? Is that edginess and that irritability and that short-temperedness. And they don't tend to like it so much. And then we go back to some of what we've been talking about in the past, right? About, when we start feeling like we're being an asshole, well, now we have to sort of detach and separate. And then now we're being distant and not invested anymore, right? So the cycle continues. But irritability tends to be that pattern that when we get there, and that happens pretty quickly, it takes maybe a year or a couple of years before that creeps in. And then we start talking about weight gain, right? That's another side effect that you'll commonly see. And all of these things come from that survival state, and our bodies starting to lock down into how do we get through each day rather than, living fully in our bodies and our minds. We live just in our bodies, just so we can survive.
Yeah. It's almost like that irritability starts as a tool, like a defensive tool, and then it becomes this thing that is just there all the time. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what it feels like. It's like I have to have this here as a protective measure, but then it just is there all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Right. It's absolutely necessary. Our brains feel safer when we're capable of accessing that rage easily, right? That's a safety mechanism. Yeah. And again, that doesn't work out so well in our social expectations, right? We're supposed to be pleasant and kind and, tolerant.
Right.
And that, and so when that doesn't come easily, when irritability comes easily, it starts to have an impact on our relationships.
Yeah. So I mentioned EMDR, which obviously was what worked for me. Is there a modality of treatment that you think is more suited for this kind of population, or is that again driven by what works best for the person?
I think I think the first answer is it's what works best for the person, but I do think that there are some patterns with personality types. Most people who, invested in serving their country or invested in serving their communities are active people. They want to feel like they're doing something, that what they're doing has purpose and has some meaning, that they can assign value to. And so one of the reasons why modalities like EMDR, prolonged exposure, and CBT are popular in these with these populations is because they're active. You're doing something each session. There is a purpose to what you're doing. There's a build up and a plan on how the efforts evolve, and that feels really good. Right? It sort of fits the mental construct of a person who wants to feel like they're contributing to an effort. Whereas sort of your traditional talk therapy, can be very effective. And some people, that is exactly what they need. They just need a place where it isn't structured and there isn't an agenda, right? Some people really thrive in that. And that's an opportunity for people to just sort of go where their minds take them. But often I could tell, and I don't do in treatment in my office anymore for any sort of long term. But I remember that I could tell the modality by if we were a couple sessions in of a talk therapy approach, somebody would finally say okay, so what are we doing? Like, when am I gonna do something? And I was like, oh, right. Okay, all right. So we want to do something. But I get it, right? It makes sense because that's the mindset, right? It goes back to why physical efforts and physical, processing of trauma, things like, PT and jujitsu and, being outdoors and chopping wood and digging ditches and feels good, for this particular population because there's an effort, there's an end goal, there's an accomplishment. And when you can invest in that and the emotional stuff comes with it, right? I can invest physically, but the byproduct is better emotional health. Well, that's a win-win, right? For this group.
Yeah. Well, and you're segueing very nicely, but what is it about? Like, is it strictly just that somatic connection with something like jujitsu or chopping wood or digging ditches or whatever the thing is for a person? Is there? I look at jujitsu like it's this weird superpower that combined with the right therapist, and it was and that was the magic formula for me. So I put I don't know, I hold it up on a pedestal like this works, but I've also talked to people who do other physical things and that works for them. And is it really as simple as that mind-body connection? And it's I don't know, what is it that makes those things so powerful in recovery?
Well, there's so much, when you're doing something physical, particularly physically demanding, there's a grounding that occurs naturally, right? Especially with something like jujitsu, especially with something like, long distance running, hiking, climbing. Your body can't afford to be distracted. You have to stay focused in the moment in order to be safe, to be successful, to keep other people safe. And so when you're grounded in that way, that provides us an opportunity for all kinds of processing to occur in our brains that are sort of deeply entrenched in us. Because when we're not grounded, when we're distracted, when we're thinking about other things or we're caring for other people, right, the parts of our brain that are responsible for our own emotional processing sort of gets put on the back burner. And we, this population in particular are really good at putting their needs on the back burner. And that's been, a lifetime for a lot of folks, right? And that's just how they operate. And so when you do something physically demanding, bringing yourself into the present, it's imperative to be in the present. And then so that allows our brains to also sort of make the connection with our bodies. jujitsu in particular is also incredibly empowering, and it's incredibly intimate, right? There's an intimacy with other humans that occurs that that really isn't embraced particularly in American culture, the way that it is embraced in jujitsu. And so when you have that kind of intimacy and empowerment put together with the physical exertion, you're unlocking parts of your brain that for many of us, we've just never had access to. Again, going back to that just wasn't how we were raised. And so that's the, from a very peripheral sort of viewpoint, that's the sort of the magic of something like jujitsu, is that sort of threefold, having to be in the present, the empowerment, and the intimacy that is required. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't ask you this when we were on our call previously, but do you train at all? Do you have any martial arts background?
I do not. No. Well,
so
I can talk a big
gym right
game.
near you.
I know it. You're absolutely right. There is, but you know what? Do you know what I don't like? The intimacy.
Yeah.
That is not my jam at all.
That makes sense.
My place is isolation. Right? So when I need my space, when I need my grounding and processing, I go out into the woods. I spend a lot of time in the mountains, and my dog is sometimes invited, but otherwise I seek out the isolation piece for my recovery. So yeah, no, jujitsu would not be my jam at all.
Yeah,
I can respect it and appreciate it though.
So, you just sort of touched on the last question I always ask everybody is, this is called Twisted Remedies because it's a play on words for jujitsu, and that's mine. And you just sort of alluded to yours, but what are your twisted remedies? Is it that isolation? Is there more than that? Do you do any other stuff that somebody can steal if they're listening? And maybe
I don't know.
Maybe it works for them.
Yeah, I don't have any magic, but I can. I think, for me, what the whole concept of nature is really, that's what grounds me. I find that if I am, in the woods, particularly I love winter hikes, snowshoes, crampons, the whole deal, and it's silent. It's nobody else is out there because they're not as crazy as I am, and that's where I find myself. The hours and hours will go by, as I'm hiking up a mountain, and I won't even realize time has passed. And I couldn't even tell you what I was thinking about. Right, I'm not reviewing the day's work. I'm not thinking about tomorrow or what I have to do. Like there's a disconnect that occurs in my brain that is really refreshing. And so that's the grounding that I do. And on the periphery of that, one of the things that I do when I can't, because I can't always get out in the woods, right? I do have to make a living. Is that I spend a lot of time planning my next hike, planning a traverse, right? Multi-night, what gear I want to pack, right? How do I hack? Because I hate to spend money on gear. I just loathe spending money on gear. So how can I hack, find some sort of hack to help me, achieve my goal without having to spend money on some ridiculous piece of equipment? And, what meals am I going to bring? And, I'll detach from whatever I'm doing and sit down and pull out a map and, just start planning for something that I'm not going to be able to do for months. But that investment feels like an investment in myself in those few moments, because it's an opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to go do this for me. And it's fun to think about and plan. But one of the things I say to people all the time is that feeling trapped is the worst state of being for any human. We know what, animals do when they're trapped, right? They do one of two things. They either rage against the captor, or they huddle in a corner to die. And that trapped feeling is really death for a lot of us, either way. And so when we're feeling overwhelmed, or we're feeling like we need space, fantasizing about an exit, a different job, what you're going to do when you retire, where's your next vacation? What are you going to do at the end of the day? Are you going for a walk? Where are you going to go? Thinking about those opportunities actually provide us some respite, even if it's just for a moment in our brain, of saying, okay, I'm overwhelmed right now, but I have this moment to look forward to. When we can't connect with what comes next for us, right? Because being in the present, don't get me wrong, absolutely imperative, but we also have to recognize that our present can sometimes suck.
Right.
What we're sitting in right now can be terrible, and it can feel like it's never going to get better. And if we allow ourselves to get sucked into that present and not allow ourselves the opportunity to look forward and create a vision of what it's going to be like when it's different, then we're never going to take that step. And so if that's mental health treatment, or if that's just today saying, I need to go for a run after work, then so be it. But we have to allow ourselves sometimes to recognize the future in order to recover in the moment.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you're the second person I've had on when I've asked about their kind of twisted remedy and what their thing is. And you're the second person who has said that you like the quiet and you like to be by yourself, because that is where the cobwebs and the dark clouds start like, that is so terrifying for me to be in that space, that when I hear people say that, I'm like, wow, what is that like?
Interesting. Yeah.
That's so,
Yep.
it's such a, like, I need stimulus, and I need something keeping me occupied, or like, all the whatever shows up, and it's just a fascinating thing to hear.
Yeah. Well, and that talks about the breadth of coping, right? Nobody is exactly the same.
Yeah.
And what you just pointed out is so important for us to actually respect and appreciate what is truly, reflective of our needs and not what we think we're supposed to do.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You hear so many times people saying things like, I probably should have had fun, when I was out with the guys the other night, but I just didn't, and I should have, so there's something wrong with me. And it's like, well, what do you mean should have, right? Like, if you either were or you weren't having a good time, and it's okay let's sit with maybe what was going on for you that was distracting you or not allowing you to be present, or whatever it was that was missing. But when we start applying, what other people think we're supposed to feel, right? Yeah. Then again, we trap ourselves, right? We're just building walls around ourselves rather than opening ourselves up to opportunities for real growth. And that, but again, we go back to a group of people who, exist in a community, right? When you serve, you exist in a community. When you are a police officer, you exist in a community, firefighters, community. We start to compare ourselves to others, and we start to think that there's something wrong with us if we don't connect with what someone else, sitting across from us at the kitchen table it connects with. And that gets to be a really dangerous space, particularly when we're trying to recover from trauma, right? Comparing our recovery or lack thereof to, what we interpret to be not even affected in the person across from us, or their rapid recovery. That's when we get stuck. We trap ourselves in a space, and then people aren't willing to get help. And it just is a vicious cycle.
Well, I think that's the key to that stigma, is you have to unlock that cultural piece that each like the firefighters have their own culture, the EMS has their own culture, cops have their own culture. Until you can kind of crack the code on each one of those, that stigma is just going to, I think, feed itself. At least that's what I saw. And I think it's gotten better over the years as more conversations are had, and people, like yourself, start kind of working with us, with that group. But it's, that culture is a big piece of it for sure.
Absolutely. The culture is a huge piece of it. And I think, there have been shifts. I've certainly, in the, over a decade or so that I've been just sitting with this population, I've definitely seen the shift, right? But there's still work to be done. And, so many other factors that we have to, start working into our cultural perspective. But at the same time, making space for tradition and making space for, the things that make the culture unique, right? So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, right? We're saying, change needs to happen, but there are also some really wonderful and amazing things about these cultures that we want to make sure gets preserved.
Absolutely.
So when you talk about cultural change, right, sometimes you see the eyes get big and go, oh, they're going to tell us that we can't, and I say, no, that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're just talking about making sure that we're staying with the times, we're staying with the expectations and needs of the members that are becoming police officers and firefighters, and so on, and what at the same time inviting them into the culture to make their own impact rather than forcing square pegs and round holes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well said. Dr. Sawyer, as somebody who is somewhere in recovery, I'm not sure if it's the front end, the back end, or the middle somewhere, but as somebody who's working their way in, through recovery, and a veteran and a first responder, I can't thank you enough. Aside from coming on the show, the work you do is important, and you clearly are passionate about it, and I'm going to speak for the groups that I can claim and say, for everyone, thank you for what you do and all the important work that you've done over the years.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's just always so awesome to be invited to have an opportunity to have these kinds of casual conversations, and really, thank you for what you're doing, because, every person that has an opportunity to feel like somebody else out there is talking about it and getting it, right? That's another step in the right direction. And I can't appreciate that enough. So thank you. Thank you for including me.
Anytime. Alrighty. Thank you again.